All right, I'll take you back 4 days. Imagine for a moment that you're at Thanksgiving dinner with your extended family. And yes, and before the meal is served, out of the blue, Grandpa starts telling a story about a far-off relative named Judd. And as he starts telling Judd's story, everyone's looking at each other like, we've never heard this one before. And you realize why you've never heard this is because Judd is a hot mess. He had 3 sons, and Grandpa says the third was a whoops baby. Come on, Grandpa, right? His first son married a woman named Mara. But Grandpa said Judd's first son was a lot like Judd, a wicked man who died an early death. Again, not really the kind of tales for Thanksgiving. But Grandpa kept on going. Judd told his second son to marry Mara, but the second son was just as selfish as the first, and he was such an awful man. He didn't want Mara as a wife. And Grandpa insinuates that his own untimely and early death wasn't all that sad for everyone. And everyone starts wondering, what's going on, right? If it was anyone else besides Grandpa, they'd be shut down. But since it's Grandpa, you let him keep going, and the story gets worse. Judd told Mara she'd have to wait for the third son to grow up, and then she could have him as her husband. But that didn't go as planned as either. Instead of her patience paying off with a husband and eventual children, she was forgotten and ignored. Grandpa says, well, Mara didn't have any kids with son number 1 or number 2 because they were horrible men. And if you didn't think it would get any weirder, just wait, because then Grandpa says after Judd's wife died, he took a business trip out of town. And Grandpa starts winking and insinuating why he went out of town. And that's what everybody says, hey, Grandpa, stop. Stop telling this story. And it's not Grandpa's story. It's actually a Bible story. But not one you'll find in any children's storybooks. It's the story of Judah and Tamar from Genesis 38. And the story gets worse. Tamar caught wind of Judah's plans, and because she was forgotten and ignored, she took things into her own hands. Judah didn't know it was Tamar, his daughter-in-law, when he went in to lie down with her. But he gave her his signet, his cord, and his staff. Then he went home thinking everything was over. But then things got worse for him. When people found out Tamar was pregnant, Judah had the audacity to say, she should be put to death because of her immorality. That's when, just like sand through the hourglass, right? I'm glad you caught that. Tamar brought out Judah's staff and signet and said, whoever's this is, he's the daddy. And to his credit, not that there's much left, Judah said, she's more righteous than I am. And he was right. Now, no one in their right mind would tell that kind of story at Thanksgiving. Actually, not even at a 4th of July family barbecue, right? That kind of story would be buried in forgotten family history. It'd never be spoken of. It's just not a story you proudly tell. But here's the crazy thing. That's in the Bible. And weirdly, it's smack dab in the middle of details about Judah's much, much better brother, Joseph. And we know about Joseph, and Joseph's the kind of guy you tell stories about, right? Because he was the kind of guy that was plastered in every children's storybook. He's upstanding in every way, patient, wise, righteous. He obeyed God and waited on God in hard situations. Grandpa should be telling Joseph's story, not Judah's story. Am I right? Like I said, today and for the next few weeks, we're looking at the opening chapters of Matthew's gospel. So if you have a Bible, please open to Matthew chapter 1. There's Bibles in the pew rows in front of you. It's on page 471 if you grab one of those blue pew Bibles. The series is called Finding God in Unexpected Places. We want to train ourselves to look for God in our own lives and in our own stories. We'll study the Christmas story in Matthew, looking for ways God shows up in unexpected places. Now, let me start reading the genealogy of Jesus. This is how Matthew's gospel begins. He writes this. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. And Perez, the father of Hezron. And Hezron, the father of Ram. And Ram, the father of Aminadab. And Aminadab, the father of Nahshon. And Nahshon, the father of Salmon. And Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab. And Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth. And Obed, the father of Jesse. And Jesse, the father of David, the king. I'll pause there, but keep your Bible open. Matthew starts telling Jesus' family history. And you'd think that he would only mention the best family members. But did you hear Joseph? I didn't. Instead of Joseph, who is mentioned? Judah, right? Good old Judah and even Tamar. That means Matthew isn't trying to hide what happened. In fact, Tamar's son with Judah is Perez. That should shock us a bit. Why? In the genealogy of Jesus, the Son of God, Messiah, anointed one sent to save the world, why would Matthew mention Judah? Why highlight him? It's probably safe to say it's the only mention of any kind of sordid or scandalous family history, right? Did you catch the others? Rahab is mentioned, and scholars agree this is the prostitute who helped the spies when they came to Jericho. She's part of Jesus' genealogy. And so is Ruth. Now, if you know the story of Ruth, you know she was upstanding. She tragically lost her husband, but faithfully clung to her mother-in-law, Naomi, even leaving her own land and people to care for her. But it's still shocking that she's included because she isn't a Jew. Ruth was a Moabite, and if you know the history between Israel and Moab, you know being a Moabite doesn't give the Israelites any warm, fuzzy feelings. Not only was Ruth a foreigner, a hated foreigner, she was poor. A widow who needed to scrape around the edges of other people's fields to get food. Now we're starting to wonder why. Why are they included in Jesus' genealogy? Instead of a well-curated and squeaky clean family tree, we're starting to spot some misfits, right? Not everyone, but there are certain, and a few screw-ups are even listed. But remember, this is Jesus' genealogy. This is how Matthew starts his gospel, telling the story of the greatest man who ever lived. Let's keep reading. In verse 6, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. So we have Judah, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and then we have a back and forth listing of good kings and bad kings, if you know Israel history, right? And included in that is David. Matthew doesn't even seem to be trying to hide the screw-ups. He actually seems to be highlighting those. Look at how he describes David's son. The one who is included is Solomon, who was born to Bathsheba. Now, Bathsheba isn't named. Instead, she's called the wife of Uriah. Matthew is flat out calling out David's sin. It's the son he had a woman with who was named, he was married to Uriah. This is the family tree that we're trotting out at the beginning of Matthew's gospel. Just think of how scandalous this is. Now here's a quick rundown of David. And man, if there's anyone who's an enigma wrapped inside a mystery, it's David. Because think about this, how should we view David? Should we call him and view him as righteous? Certainly not, because of what I'm about to tell you. But then, should we call him and think of him as a wretched, wicked human being? Well, we can't do that either because the Bible describes him as a man after God's own heart. He wrote half the Psalms and did so many things that honored God and were good for God's people. But Matthew isn't highlighting his good qualities. He highlights this. Here's what happened. When all the Israelites were fighting in a far-off land, David the king was sitting back in his lazy boy. Well, actually not. He was out on his rooftop peeping at women who were bathing. I mean, that's not a good start, David. His eyes land on Bathsheba, and he called her to his palace. Now, just a little side note. I don't know what kind of things you've heard about Bathsheba, but we have to know the context. She was a married woman in ancient Israel, and the king called her to his palace. We don't know if she was willing or not. But if she wasn't willing, she still did not have any choice in the matter. There was a power dynamic. She would have been forced into this. Now, some would say, well, she isn't named because of how bad her sin was, but I'm going to disagree. This is on David. I think she isn't named to highlight how awful David's actions are. He had a child with the wife of another man. This is real bad, but it gets worse. Again, not a tale for family gatherings, not something you want to highlight or even talk about. But again, this is in the Bible because it's real. It really happened, and if the Bible was fabricated, this kind of stuff would not be included. So when Bathsheba found out she was pregnant with David's son, David did the honorable thing and confessed, right? Nope. He made it worse. He called Uriah home from the front lines and said, "Hey, Uriah, rest, relax, wink, wink, go home. Be with your wife." But Uriah, being more righteous and honorable than David, said, "No way. How could I? With my fellow Israelites at war, how could I go and be with my wife when they can't be with theirs? I'll wait here." What an awesome man, right? Uriah. So he slept at the palace as though he were at war. Then David came clean, right? Nope. He sent him back to the front lines and then instructed his commander to have Uriah be killed in battle. Uriah's blood is dripping from David's hands. David is responsible for his death. And this is what's highlighted in Jesus' genealogy. This is not family history anyone would be excited to share. This section then ends after alternating between good and bad kings with the deportation to Babylon. Now that's when the whole nation of Israel had worn God's patience down so thin, they kept rebelling again and again and again, that God was finally like, "That's it, you're in a timeout," right? Like that's what it was. Things got so bad, God kicked them out of the promised land. Again, not really something you want to highlight when introducing the main character of history. It's not the stuff of family legends. It's like a list of family shame, the screw-ups and misfits. In fact, following King David, like I said, every other king alternates between a good and a bad king. It's as though Matthew was acknowledging, we don't have it all together. This list is not perfect. In fact, it's got a lot of people who did a lot of bad things. Let's read the rest of this section in Matthew 1, back to verse 12. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon were 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. Now verse 17 brings this all together. There's a symmetry to how Matthew presented this. He highlighted three people in one event. A starting person, Abraham, 14 generations, a significant person, David, right? 14 generations, an event, the deportation, 14 generations, Jesus. So they all represent something significant. I want to look at this, and then we want to do some searching to see how we can apply the gospel. It began with Abraham, and that isn't surprising since God told Abraham to leave everything he knew to follow God. And Abraham, what did he do? He obeyed. Then God promised he'd have more offsprings than the stars in the heavens. Not only that, but there's the important piece. God promised to bless Abraham, and through Abraham and his ancestors, they would be a blessing to all people. That's the start of Jesus' line. Matthew's highlighting God's promise that exists from Abraham to Jesus. And it hints towards the blessing that Jesus is for all people everywhere. That's the start. It's a good high start, right? Then 14 generations. And because of what we know about David, it makes us wonder, why is David significant? But that's the crazy thing. David represents something important in the history of God's people. David was chosen by God to be king. As surprising as it is, David represents good kings because so much of what he did was good. It's like the height of Israelite history to think of the rule of King David and then his fall. And the nation follows. Fast forward 14 generations and we get to the depths of despair, the deportation, their lowest point. And that's significant because God's history with his people is best understood in terms of a covenant. A covenant is an agreement between people to act a certain way in relationship. Our closest parallel to covenant is marriage. So it's like a marriage between God and his people. And the deportation represents Israel cheating on God. Again and again, they left God and chased after other lovers. They broke their side of the covenant. Everything was a mess. The people had messed it up. And that's where the gospel comes breaking in. The final piece of the puzzle is 14 generations from the deportation, we get to Jesus Christ. And Jesus represents a brand new covenant. The people had messed it up, but God says, we're doing it again with Jesus doing both sides. A new way God will relate to his people. It isn't about how well they do, it's only about God. This is the good news of the gospel. God becomes for us what we cannot be for ourselves. God is faithful even when we are faithless. That's the coming of Jesus. And Matthew puts an exclamation point on this by showing that at the very start of his gospel, Jesus is the rightful king of Israel, the long-awaited Messiah who is born of the family line of Abraham and David. And there's an interesting word choice in verse 16. All throughout this, the genealogy, there's a certain word Matthew uses to show each successive generation born from the previous. That is up until verse 16. And the ESV changes the wording to signify this. It was all along blank the father of blank the father of blank, right? Up until Jesus, and what do we read? Of whom Jesus was born. In all the other ones, the word signifies the active human form of the verb. But not in verse 16. There it's the divine passive form. So it's God, not Joseph or Mary, as the object of the verb. And what does this tell us? Something different happened. Jesus is not just another in a long line of humans. Jesus represents something different, a change, a break from this past. The divine coming to rescue what humanity made a mess of. Jesus has come, and that's what we celebrate in Advent. So I want to step back and look again. What have we found here? And to be honest, it's a scandalous genealogy. A bunch of men and women who messed up. People who failed. Some who did really bad things. Misfits. Jesus' family secrets exposed, right? So let's look for the gospel. Try and find God in unexpected places. Where is he? What is the good news here? Now, it's not just that Jesus owns his family line. I mean, I think it's crazy to think Matthew would start his gospel like this. Jesus owns it. He's not ashamed. In fact, there are ways God gets more glory from the sin than if this was squeaky clean. And there's also this. There is not a failure that can thwart God's purposes. There isn't a failure that you can make, that I can make, that can thwart God's purposes. It's not like God saw what happened with Judah and was like, oh man, it's all over. I can't work with this. That's not what happened. Listen, we can't delay God. We can't thwart God. We can't send God on a detour. We can't even make things harder for God. I mean, that's amazing, right? God has been working with fallen humanity ever since Genesis 3. And there's not one time that we've witnessed God wringing his hands or God going to plan B. The Bible describes us as sheep gone astray. We're frail and prone to screwing things up. We regularly make a mess of things. And listen, none of that can stop God. Okay? None of it can stop God. It's a little insane to even think the church still exists, right? I mean, the big C church, like the universal church. Humans have been in charge of that for a while. Some of you might be thinking, oh, give it time, Eric. We're doing a pretty good job messing it all up right now. But honestly, stop and realize the church is God's possession. We are God's people. God said the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. So if Satan can't destroy the church, it's not like we can ruin it. And if this group of screw-ups didn't wreck it, we can't either. Right? So let's end with some good news as we review the gospel and apply it here. We find God working, redeeming, and getting glory among the screw-ups. And really, that's us. We got to see ourselves in this. Here's what I want you to hear this morning. God works in your pain and in your failure. God works in your pain and your failure. He redeems your pain and your failure, and God will get glory through it all. If you feel like a screw-up, if you feel like your story isn't a story anyone at the family would want to tell, if you feel like your guilt or your past or the things you've done are too much for God, I have good news for you. First of all, God isn't ashamed of you. God isn't ashamed of you. Like, think about it. He owns this. This isn't buried in the back of the Bible. These stories are front and center in the introduction to the Gospels. And second, God can redeem any story. God can redeem any story. The gospel is good news for everyone. Those who've screwed up, those who feel guilt and shame, those who feel less than, those who've been hurt and wounded by others, those who are down and out. Jesus has good news for you. Here's how we see the beauty of the gospel among those I mentioned. Consider Tamar. She was mistreated by others, forgotten and ignored. It's crazy to think about when you know Israel's history. Judah was one of 12 brothers, the 12 tribes, right? I've already mentioned Joseph. He was great. Many other brothers were too. But who did God choose to carry on the family line? It was through Tamar and Judah. It was through Tamar and Judah. So if you feel forgotten and ignored, know that God sees you. God knows your pain, and he works in the midst of all that happens to us. And Judah, I meant it when I said he's a hot mess. But consider the grace of God in his life. God could have picked any other brother, any other marriage to carry along the line. But in a shocking twist of grace, it was Judah. And it was Judah's son born out of sin. This scandalous union was, by God's providence, used for God's purposes. And in a way, it paves the way for what we're about to see next week with what happened to Mary. You know, her situation was really peculiar as well, right? We'll get more into that next week. Rahab's inclusion in the family line is strange too. You see, where she's mentioned doesn't fully line up with the timeline, but there's no other Rahab we know of. What's likely is that she was taken as a wife of an Israelite after the fall of Jericho, and it was her family line that led to Boaz. So what's significant about her inclusion is her profession. She was a Gentile prostitute, and yet she risked her life to save the spies. And then one Israelite risked his reputation to take her as his wife. He risked his reputation to take her as his wife. Think of what it was to take a Gentile prostitute as your wife. And that points forward to Jesus. Because isn't that exactly what Jesus does for us? We cheat on God. The Bible alludes to sin as spiritual adultery against God. And what did Jesus do? In a way, Jesus marries us. He takes us in even with our past and our ugly past. Even though we are screw-ups, Jesus loves us that much. That's the beauty of the gospel. It's not what you've done. It's not what you do. It's not what you have that defines you. There's a rich beauty here. The gospel is on display in these stories. Jesus turns everything around. Henry Nouwen says this: we are not what we do. We are not what we have. We are not what others think of us. Coming home is claiming the truth. I am the beloved child of the loving Creator. I'm the beloved child of a loving Creator. And Rahab proves that in stunning ways. In the end, she's not defined by what she did. Well, what about Ruth? A poor foreigner and Israelite, a Moabite, hated by Israelites. And yet, Boaz did not despise Ruth for her poverty, nor did he abhor her for the wickedness of her country. And in this way, Boaz is like Jesus. Jesus does not despise us because of our past. He does not look on us as poor beggars, even though spiritually we are. So Ruth shows us Jesus through how Boaz treats her. What is Jesus like? We find out he's welcoming. He's loving, he's forgiving, and he's willing to take us in and bless us again and again and again. So as we enter the Christmas season, we can't allow shame or guilt or feelings of inferiority to rob us of joy. We found out that the gospel overcomes all that. Jesus can turn it all around. In Jesus' economy, the last are first. The ignored are and the forgotten are exalted. Sinners can be redeemed, and poor strangers are brought in. Do you hear that? The last are first. The ignored, the forgotten are exalted. The sinners can be redeemed, and the poor strangers are brought in. There's a beauty to the gospel, a beauty that invites us in. It started with Abraham. It continued through Ruth right to Jesus, leaving something behind to follow God. Abraham left Ur. Ruth left Moab, and Jesus left the comforts of heaven to come be born in a stinky manger for you and for me. And Jesus then calls you and I to leave our old lives to join in covenant with him. Ruth shows us one more thing. It's how to respond to what Jesus has done for us. Richard Ward wrote this about what Ruth teaches us. Just as Ruth left her country and her father's house and all her kindred, and then was ennobled by this marriage, so we must likewise leave our old lives, so that we might be joined in marriage to Christ. That's the beauty here. Without Jesus, all the screw-ups are just stuck in their sins, their mistakes, and their failures. But through Jesus, it's all healed and renewed and redeemed. And so I want to answer the question, what does it mean to be joined in marriage to Jesus? It seems like a really strange way to say things. Richard Ward was an old guy, right? Old dead guy. What he means is to put your trust in Jesus. We cling to him by faith, trusting that what he has done is enough for us. Trusting that his grace is sufficient. We're joining in the covenant that he's established. We know he not only loves the screw-ups, we know Jesus died for the screw-ups. And now we found God. Here he is among us, the screw-ups, right? He has come, the light of the world. The people who have walked in darkness have seen a great light. He has come. And he invites us into a deeper relationship with him. He offers to redeem your past. He's the greatest gift, the greatest treasure, the one who brings true Christmas joy because of his forgiveness and his love. Let's pray together. Our good and